So today I intend to compare religious and scientific definitions of evil with a capital E, and then further compare them with the myth of the vampire as the embodiment of such evil, according to Bram Stoker's, Friedrich Murnau's, Tom Browning's, and Terry Pratchett's representations of the myth of the vampire. So definitions of evil will differ greatly depending on a person's socio-cultural background and beliefs. However, I am confident that you will all instinctively agree that the horrors associated with this image and the memories of Nazi concentration camps can certainly be labeled as evil. Of course, and unfortunately, history provides us with thousands of examples of human depravity. And I could indeed have chosen an image from Stalin's or Pol Pot's Reigns of Terror, but it is in Nazi Germany that an attempt at defining evil in sociological and psychological terms begins. German-born and Jewish social psychologist and philosopher Erich Fromm published from his American exile his reflections on how such evil could have come to be. In The Heart of Man, he came up with the term malignant narcissism, which he defined as severe mental sickness, the most severe pathology and the root of the most vicious destructiveness and inhumanity, and the quintessence of evil. We'll return to a psychiatric and psychological explanation of what evil is and how it works later on, but let's first have a look at a religious definition of malignancy. I'm going to focus on a primarily Christian definition, as I will be then comparing it with the modern Western version of the myth of the vampire. From this perspective, evil is the opposite of good, and since God, by definition, is the source of all good, it is the opposite of God as well. Therefore, since God is the creator of everything, evil must consist in conflict and destruction, as well as in disease and decay, both of which result in death. If we, on the other hand, understand evil to be the absence of God/good, then evil will be understood as a void, an emptiness, an endless yearning, an insatiable hunger, much like that of the ever-thirsty vampire. If we concentrate on these specific implications of the notion of evil, we will come up with a very telling image of the four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, pestilence, famine, and death. Therefore, from a terrestrial perspective, evil is the enemy of life, much like the undead vampire. If we then go back to the aforementioned definitions and we elaborate on the idea of evil as the absence of good and the idea of hunger, it is not difficult to reach the conclusion that evil is death and at the same time a form of unquenchable desire. If we take these two notions and we consider them as opposites, we are then going to be confronted with the clash between two opposing forces, fear and desire, which are at the heart, coincidentally, of the anxiety that shapes Gothic fiction, the Gothic genre, which is the very genre chosen by Stoker to frame his world-famous Dracula. The eponymous vampire is caught between fear of death and the desire for life and power, although, of course, this means he is de facto stuck in between life and death, and both actually being out of his reach. We then see that all the terms used before can be recycled to define a vampire. So we define evil as conflict, destruction, disease, decay, death, emptiness, loneliness, hunger, desire, and the same can be said, the same terms can be used to define a vampire. However, there's another mythical figure that also springs to mind if we look at these terms: Satan, the enemy of God, he who is so full of hatred as to be the enemy of humans' eternal life. So we have a terrestrial perspective that we've covered already. Now we're looking at a spiritual perspective, what spiritual evil is. Satan, like the vampire, is not only an oppositional force, but also an absence, the eternal darkness caused by the absence of God's light. I'd like you to take a quick look at this list of Satan's attributes according to the Bible, as we will later compare them with the attributes that Dracula is invested with by Stoker. So Satan is proud, and here you have just a one verse that can be used as a reference, but there are many instances of this pride in the Bible. Satan is envious, he's obviously cruel, deceitful, subtle, he's a liar, destructive, deadly. We can now go back to a scientific definition of evil. In order to understand malignant narcissism, we first need to understand cluster B personality disorders. According to the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, that is to say, this is the number one reference manual for most, if not all, psychiatrists and psychologists all over the world, not just in the Western world. So there are, according to this manual, there are 3 groups or clusters of personality disorders. A personality disorder is a form of neurosis, not of psychosis, which means, and this is important, that a person with a personality disorder is perfectly conscious of their acts. Their actions are deliberate, and yet these actions typically conform to a behavioral pattern that is considered peculiarly odd in the case of cluster A personality disorders, or is considered as harmful to the self in the case of cluster C personality disorders, or is destructive to both the self and others in the case of cluster B personality disorders. And there are 4 cluster B personality disorders: histrionic, borderline, narcissistic, and antisocial. Antisocial in the sense that one goes against society, not in the sense that one does not like to be around people. That is asocial, not antisocial. Even though some people can be said to be exclusively on the spectrum from one of these disorders, oftentimes their symptoms overlap. We are not going to discuss histrionic personality disorder, as there is serious talk of removing it from the next edition of the DSM, and neither are we going to discuss the borderline personality disorder, as in its malignant form it practically merges with narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. We are then going to focus exclusively on NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and ASPD, since in the malignant varieties they tend to merge into each other. But what do we qualify, how do we qualify a personality disorder of this kind? What is NPD or ASPD when they become malignant? Why do we call them malignant? We qualify them with this term. So NPD occurs on a spectrum. On this side, we have what is known as healthy narcissism, basically your self-esteem, what allows your ego to be functional and you to have a good sense of self-worth and self-respect. Then further on the spectrum, we have those who exhibit a number of traits that are typical of NPD, but they haven't entered a pathological dimension yet. So somebody who has traits of can be said to be rather obnoxious, but will still retain enough empathy to feel remorse for their acts and enough self-awareness to be able to modify their behavior. A full-blown narcissistically disordered person, on the contrary, does not have such abilities. A personality disorder is persistent, which means that they are that way all the time and always have been like that. It is pervasive in that it affects every aspect of their lives, not just the personal life or the professional life, everything. And it is personal, which means that it cannot be ascribed to cultural norms. So for somebody, if somebody is treating a person from a different race as inferior in the 18th century in Europe, well, that could be ascribed to a cultural norm that sees other races as inferior. But nowadays, and in certain cultures, this is no longer acceptable. So somebody that consistently treats people from other races as inferior, and depending on the context, can be ascribed to narcissistic disorder. Or it could be somebody who treats just people from different backgrounds and not specifically different gender or different race. It's just an example, but I think it kind of illustrates the point. And so most NPD people are extremely difficult to live or work with but if they reach malignancy, they become downright abusive. Disclaimer, while all malignant narcissists are abusers, not all abusers are malignant narcissists. And B, the most extreme forms of abuse can typically be traced back to a malignant narcissist. Even though he was never officially diagnosed, a classic example, textbook example of malignant narcissism would be Adolf Hitler. When NPD and SPD converge and overlap on the malignant end of the respective spectrum, the result is what the world expert on NPD, Sam Vaknin, author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, calls narcissistic psychopathy. And most psychiatrists and psychologists would identify as the dark triad. According to the DSM-4, NPD is defined by the following traits. Has a grandiose sense of self-importance, e.g., exaggerates achievements and talents, expects to be recognized as superior without commensurate achievements, is preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love, believes that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status people or institutions, requires excessive admiration, has a sense of entitlement and reasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations, is interpersonally exploitative, is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of him or her, shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes, lacks empathy, is unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings or needs of others. And by the way, you only need to qualify for 5 of these in order to be considered to be diagnosed as NPD. On the other hand, we have ASPD, failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest, deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying, impulsive or failure to plan ahead, irritability and aggressiveness, as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults, reckless disregard for the safety of others and of the self, consistent responsibility as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations, lack of remorse as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated or stolen from another person. So if we combine NPD and SPD, the result is the aforementioned condition of narcissistic psychopathy, which gives us individuals who are severely, pathologically grandiose, arrogant, entitled, thirsty for unlimited power, exploitative, aggressive to the point of violence, envious, revengeful, who lack empathy and remorse and are reckless in their behavior. Or, in other words, we'd have someone who is narcissistic, Machiavellian. In order to reach a goal, it doesn't matter what I do or if I have to use people to reach a goal. So people are expendable. My goal is not. Or someone who lacks empathy, or rather, who does possess what American psychiatrists called cold empathy, that is to say, the ability to perceive and decodify the emotional state of the interlocutor, so as to use it to their advantage, but lacks sympathy, that is to say, they do not care how the other person feels. Even though malignant narcissism has not been officially accepted by the APA and not included in the DSM, it has been increasingly used by a large number of respected professionals over the past 30 years. And it is very popular amongst the victims of cluster B abuse, particularly on online platforms, social media, and in forums, which makes it very useful also if you look at it from a cultural studies perspective, it makes it very useful to describe and interpret certain cultural productions, which is what interests me. All right. So, specifically, if we take Vaknin's set of narcissistically psychopathic traits and apply them to diagnose, quote unquote, Stoker's most famous character, we can see that Count Dracula has a grandiose sense of self when he speaks of himself as if he were a monarch, and believes himself entitled to be arrogant and condescending to others, as he descended from Attila the Hun, and of whom he speaks in supernatural terms. So he thinks of himself very greatly, in very great terms. He shamelessly exploits others for his own benefit, showing utter lack of empathy and a tendency towards recklessness. He came again and again, though he had to come alone from the bloody field where his troops were being slaughtered, since he knew that he alone could ultimately triumph. So when he was alive as a warrior, he was as bloodthirsty as he would then become when he turned into an undead vampire. And they say that he thought only of himself. Bah! What good are peasants without a leader? And there is certainly no trace of remorse in his actions. His action is based on selfishness. This is Van Helsing speaking of Dracula. His action is based on selfishness. He confines himself to one purpose. That purpose is remorseless. He is deceitful, as the fact that he studies his phrase in order to mimic them and pass as one of them shows, just like a wolf in sheep's skin. And yes, as a literal wolf, or he can be as subtle in his deceiving ways as mist, as the air itself, but as confusing as fog. Again, literally. Finally, I hardly have to remind you of his aggressive temper and violent outbursts. This is how he treats his slave Renfield, the lunatic in the asylum. As the face was exposed, I could see that he was horribly bruised, as though the face had been beaten against the floor. And this is how he addresses his enemies. My revenge is just begun. I spread it over centuries, and time is on my side. Your girls that you all love are already mine. If we then compare these attributes with those traditionally assigned to the devil in Judeo-Christian cultures, it becomes evident that Dracula synthesizes both a scientific and a popular definition of evil. We have defined malignant narcissism. Let's now take a closer look at its causes, at the root of evil, as it were. Let's see if we can draw any parallelisms between malignant personality disorders and vampirism in Stoker's novel. So, NPD, malignant or otherwise, is trauma-based. The child has been subjected to abuse in their early years. The child's main caregiver or caregivers have systematically and alternatively put the child on a pedestal, worshipping them as if they were godlike, what would be commonly known as spoiling the child, and then rejected the child as worthless, humiliating and punishing them, or at best simply objectifying them, denying them a human identity. The consequence is the split self, polarized between perfection and worthlessness, self-worship and self-loathing. In order to cope with such a dire psychological landscape, the child develops a set of defense mechanisms, which in time will consolidate into a second identity that suffocates and eventually kills, so to speak, the original personality and identity of the child. The child and later the adult will always systematically deny to be anything less than perfect and refuse to ever acknowledge or take responsibility for any mistake or wrongdoing. At the same time, the child and later the adult will systematically project everything of which the sadistic superego accuses them onto the nearest person, thus scapegoating this other person. Eventually, the false self-image they built for themselves to make up for the real self that was destroyed by the caregiver becomes larger and larger until it is all there is. Narcissus, see the painting here, drowns in an abysm of selflessness in the effort to sustain himself with what is but a ghost, an empty reflection of a true ego. To avoid drowning in the nothingness that lies behind this reflection, everything and everyone is expendable. The child and later the adult will need to do anything they can at all to fuel up this hologrammatic version of their self, so as not to expose the emptiness that lies within. The result, of course, is a walking shell, a living dead. An undead, if you like. In fact, if we take child abuse out of the equation, as it is not mentioned by Stoker nor in folkloric renditions of the myth, we don't need to stretch the parallelism too far. In the case of vampires too, we are left with a split self and an empty shell. Dracula is both great and insignificant, a dragon and a moth or a bat, a warrior and sheer mist. He is aristocratic and ignoble, well-mannered and sadistic, cultivated and barbaric. He is dead and undead. This time, there could be no error. This is the famous quote from Stoker's Dracula. For the man who was close to me, Count Dracula, this is Jonathan Harker speaking as he's shaving in front of a mirror, and I could see him over my shoulder, but there was no reflection of him in the mirror. The whole room behind me was displayed, but there was no sign of a man in it, except myself. So why is there no reflection in the mirror? Because a vampire, just like a narcissistically disordered person, lacks a true self. They can't see themselves because there is literally nothing for them to see. What others see is the inflated, hyperbolic false self that shields the empty core. Needless to say, neither the vampire nor the NPD can risk anyone getting too close to them, as intimacy would provide the other person with the opportunity to see what lies behind the armor of the false self. Hence, the vampires and NPD's everlasting loneliness. The absence of a true self also implies that, to use Van Helsing's terminology in Dracula, the vampire has a child brain, and so has the NPD person. This does not mean, by any means, that their ability for reasoning is somehow impaired. On the contrary, they can be very intelligent. But from an emotional point of view, they are severely stunted, to the point of being as underdeveloped as a 2-year-old. Because of their emotional underdevelopment and the lack of a fully formed ego, they cannot understand the concept of boundaries, the fact that they are not the universe and the universe is not them. Hence, the sense of entitlement, the magical thinking, and the systematic disregard for other people's boundaries, their feelings and wishes. Exactly like Dracula, who is constantly trying to get himself to cross into other people's lives, houses, and to penetrate the ultimate frontier, their skin. Just like people with NPD, the so-called emotional vampires of the real world, just like they need their fix, that is to say, narcissistic supply, Dracula, a literal vampire, needs his blood, without which he cannot flourish. The NPD's unquenchable thirst is for the external admiration they need in order to fuel this false self, and for other people's emotions in order to make up for the lack of normal emotions. Dracula's thirst is for eternal life and unlimited power. Without the supply, both the NPD and Dracula decompensate, shrink, and wither. Therefore, they both need to be surrounded by people, which is evidenced by the Count's plan to move to a metropolis from the solitude of his castle in Transylvania, so as to guarantee a steady flow of supply/blood. Both the NPD and Count Dracula study their victims, as we have already mentioned, and make use of the aforementioned cold empathy beneath which their humanity lies, to better manipulate people by triggering the right emotional responses. Dracula and the NPD know how to seduce, charm, and use their cold empathy in order to feign charism, elicit a warm response from their victims, and reach their goals. As is the case initially with Jonathan Harker and with Renfield, who fall prey to the seduction of Dracula. And Renfield, as you know, is the lunatic that is used by Dracula in order to gain access to Mina Harker and transform her into a vampire. To the NPD masterly use of manipulation corresponds the Count's literal mind reading and mind control, and to Dracula's minions and enslaved vampires, my creatures to do my bidding, correspond the cohorts of people who willingly or unwillingly are used by the NPD to enlarge their sphere of influence or to avoid accountability for their scheming and evil doing. They are affectionately known as, among the victims of narcissistic abuse, as flying monkeys, a reference, of course, to the Wizard of Oz. If the NPD perceives this image, if the NPD perceives that their image of perfection is being somehow challenged, or their wishes and plans are somehow being thwarted, the false ego suffers a blow that is known as a narcissistic injury. The result is a fury that is only comparable to that of Count Dracula. The sudden animal snarling, the physical violence, the ocean of hatred that suddenly overwhelms the victim of narcissistic rage are best pictured through the metaphor of the beastly vampire when it fights for his undead life. There is no wrath as that of the malignant NPD. In Friedrich Börner's interpretation of Count Dracula's character, rebaptized as Count Olaf, we can see actor Max Schreck transform into a being unmistakably other, a horrifying alien. His subhuman features and impossibly long claws inscribe him firmly within the sphere of monstrosity. Here, there is hardly any attempt at passing as human, as if the Count didn't really care about people's impressions. Externally monstrous from beginning to end, he never grows younger and looks more extraterrestrial than animal-like, therefore being an alien rather than an oppositional other. He is sexually repulsive and doesn't make any attempts at seducing his victims. Furthermore, his movements, if you remember the film, are rather robotic. When he floats out of his victim's room as if rolling over rails, or when he emerges from his coffin with the stiffness of a board. It is indeed a predator that we're looking at, a single-minded, undisguised, and lone wolf type of predator. This is a killing machine, and to borrow the expression from Alien, the Eighth Passenger, an organism that is optimized for survival. If we consider that the more extreme forms of ASPD are described as robotic, not human, extraterrestrial, and that they do not need narcissistic supply and therefore do not care about causing the right impression, we could conclude that this is more of a psychopathic or sociopathic vampire than it is narcissistic. Thus, in Nosferatu, evil is antisocial, abhuman, and is likened to a disease, a plague that destroys others. In short, evil is described as an interspecies predator. In Tom Browning's 1931 version of Dracula, sorry, what was that again? 10 minutes? Yes, good. Yes, in Tom Browning's 1931 version of Dracula, evil has evolved into a charming mimetic predator, perfectly passes for an outstanding member of society. Here we can see Bela Lugosi interpreting the exquisitely well-mannered Count. This is a rehumanized Dracula who does not grow any younger, but neither does he grow older, and whose shape-shifting, he transforms into a bat, into mist, into rats. Yet this shape-shifting never undermines his hypnotically seductive performance of a perfectly socialized, sexually attractive gentleman. Lucy, in this version, falls for him the second she sets eyes on him at the theatre. And even though Browning uses a ray of light, as you can see there, to represent the way in which the Count hypnotizes his victims into obedience and still retains a few of Mark Schreck's signature poses from Nosferatu, this is a much finer specimen of predator that hardly needs his supernatural powers to conquer and harvest his victims. In short, this socialite predator is much more insidious and dangerous than its 1922 version, and because it looks human, is deceivingly attractive, and in fact has become an intra-species predator versus the interspecies predator that was the 1922 version of this character. In Francis Ford Coppola's interpretation of Stoker's novel, evil has evolved even further. Dracula is still narcissistic, Machiavellian, and lacks empathy, but has now been provided with a motivation: love. There is an actual romance going on between Mina and the Count. So what we have here is a situation in which obviously viewers will empathize with the character and sympathize rather, I should say, with Dracula. And since the origin of Dracula's rejection of God, according to this particular version of the myth, this is Coppola's version of Dracula, this is not to be found in Stoker's novel. So the origin of Dracula's rejection of God and good was his beloved wife's death by suicide and her subsequent condemnation to hell. evil is here depicted as the absence of love, which of course in turn makes love also the remedy to evil. Yet, if we look beyond this romanticized and glamorized version of the Prince of Darkness, which is why I've called this the Prince Charming of Darkness, Dracula's love is obsessive and both hetero and self-destructive, and it's in short very pathological to the point of actually being more of an addiction and a fixed idea and a dependency than what we could otherwise define as love. It's a morbid rendition, pathological version of love. Interestingly, though, and in accordance with current psychiatric and psychological studies of malignant narcissism, as we have seen, trauma is the origin of evil. So this, in this sense, Coppola is using what the most current theories are. But sadly, the other conclusion to which Coppola reaches, or wants us to reach, the fact that love can heal the original wound. We can actually see literally a wound in Dracula's castle chapel being healing as Dracula finally passes on and dies. So this conclusion is still unsubstantiated by science. There is no cure for psychopathy, nor is there for narcissistic personality disorder that we know of as of now. In Pratchett's fantasy novel Carpe Jugulum, seemingly a parody of the genre, and not just of Stoker's novel, but also of the different Hollywood versions of Dracula, we found, however, a most profound reflection on the origin of evil. Once more, the myth of the vampire and its various representation in literature and the popular arts has been deployed as a means to explain and describe the nature of ultimate evil. If I'm a vampire, she said, I won't know good from evil. In other words, vampires are still seen as antisocial, ruled only by their own desire. They know no other law. And there are two kinds of vampires, two counts in Carpe Jugulum. The old count is the quintessential image of the Hollywood vampire. The mist rose in a boiling tower. There was a moment of discontinuity, a feeling of sliced time, and then a figure stood behind Vlad and Lacrimosa. He was rather taller than most men, and wearing an evening dress that might have been in style once upon a time. His hair was streaked with grey and brushed back over his ears in a way that gave the impression his head had been designed for its aerodynamic efficiency. Another bloody vampire, said Nanny. Not any old vampire, said Igor, hopping from one foot to the other. It's the old master, old Red Eyes, he's back. Igor, of course, this character is taken from Young Frankenstein and has a lisp when he speaks. So this is a very traditional version of Dracula, or of a count, of a vampire. The young count, on the other hand, is, if I can find, what was this? Yes. Is no longer bound by tradition. He has trained himself to be unaffected by garlic, religious icons, even by daylight. Believes in ruthless survivors of the fittest, so we go back to this Darwinistic idea of species and success as species that we say. I was mentioning Alien, the Eighth Passenger, an organism that is optimized for survival and intends to enslave humans to the new race of vampires, spelled with a Y, who will milk them, much in the same way that machines milk humans in The Matrix, if you have seen the film. And also, this new count fantasizes with ruling over the whole world, not just their own little castle in the mountains. So these two kinds of vampires. On the one hand, we have a vampire traditionals with the right spelling, modern spelling, and then we have a vampire spelled with a Y, this is the modern, the new form of vampirism, but it's paradoxically spelled in an antiquated way with a Y. So the first one would be traditional and a classic malignant NPD be, whereas the other mutant vampire will look more like a narcissistic psychopath as defined by Sam Vaknin. And so when we look at evil in this novel, we see two kinds. One is the animalistic type of evil that we are used to, and is represented by the old count, Magpie. Magpie is the family name, that comes during the night secretly and is more animal-like in its form. But then we have a legalized form of collective evil, such as, for instance, in concentration camps, that comes greyly by day on a list. So, and to conclude, according to the old witch who often functions as Pratchett's mouthpiece, Granny Weatherwax, evil begins by treating people as things. Sin, young man, is when you treat people as things, including yourself. That's what sin is. It's a lot more complicated than that. No, it ain't. When people say things are a lot more complicated than that, that means they're getting worried that they won't like the truth. People as things, that's where it starts. Oh, I'm sure there are worse crimes, but they start with thinking about people as things. So this, of course, is a Machiavellian version of definition of evil, and it's very similar to the dark triad that I was explaining a little earlier. It shows lack of empathy, so we have 2 out of the 3 sides of the dark triad. And in this sense, vampires are represented as a metaphor for human capacity for evil in this novel, as we can probably argue in the other versions of the myth of the vampire. Human-made, but why? Because vampires are human-made myths that are used to explain human behavior, and in fact, they are part of our discourse for identity construction. The reflection, remember the scene with the mirror? What is seen, what the Count sees literally, is a human face. It is Jonathan's, but if you look at it in narcissistic terms, that's what there is. There is a human being, but it's not them. So, and they also die as humans. If you think about it, they're not different, not that different. If you drive a stake through my heart and chop my head off, I can guarantee I'll die, just as the old Count. And their desire are very human. In the end, it's life, it's power, very human in a malignant version of humanity, in an inhumane version of humanity. So, on the one hand, yes. In fact, at the end of the novel, we have this witch, Granny Weatherwax, literally turning this family, the new Count and his family, into humans. Because when the Count tries to turn her into a vampire by biting her neck, she actually turns them into versions of herself. So they all start craving sweet tea and biscuits, just like an old lady. That's what Granny Weatherwax is. In fact, in this novel, and this is what I'm trying to argue here and contend here, vampires are our doppelgangers. They are our evil twins. So, in Carpe Jugulum, malignant narcissism is evolving into these narcissistic psychopathy that Sam Vaknin is right now trying to describe. It is becoming bolder, but more importantly, because the new Count, intends to rule and conquer every single country on the planet. It's not a planet, but anyway, in this world, we can say that narcissism, malignant narcissism, this narcissistic psychopathy is becoming political, and it's becoming a sociological issue. Therefore, it's becoming a collective issue, not just a psychological problem that certain individuals may suffer from. Vampirism, as a general conclusion, vampirism comes surprisingly close to what a scientific definition of evil is, from what we can tell in nowadays standards. So malignant NPD and ASPD, they are surprisingly, the myth of Dracula is a surprisingly accurate version of malignant personality disorders. And the myth of the vampire is evolving, as we've seen throughout these different, the evolution of the character in each and every one of these texts. And this evolution is then reflected in the evolution of these malignant personality disorders in real life. And that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amaya, for this very interesting interdisciplinary study, which looks at literary works and films through the lens of psychology. Now, if anyone has any question with regards to the lecture. Well, then I would like to start. You've talked about in a given work how vampires could represent ourselves or our malignant selves. Mm-hmm. So how accurate can be the representation in fantasy literature or in fantasy films of real psychological problems in real society?
Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? So I've tried to, if you take garlic out of the equation, everything else basically that we know are the traditions and superstitions that surround vampires can be somehow be considered as a metaphor for one of the or the other of these strategies or traits of malignant cluster B personality disorders. So it's a very broad question. I don't know if you would like me to give you a more specific example, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, so if a person with malignant narcissistic personality disorder does not get enough attention over a certain period of time, in the same way a vampire will need to feed off people's blood, they will literally feel as if they were dying. So it is not obviously the physical, we don't see physical symptoms that we see in a vampire that becomes older and is weaker, but you will see a narcissistically disordered person decompensate to the point of almost reaching psychosis, even though this is not a psychotic disorder, not at all. They will start becoming paranoid, they will retreat in their home, they will become more and more aggressive, and their inner child, the child brain, will become more and more evident. And the dysfunctionality of these persons will probably lead them to have severe problems at work, and probably sometimes being just made redundant because of this, being rejected by everybody in their circle and shunned as if they were literally plagued with something. And another example, you can see many instances of Dracula's aggressiveness being portrayed as animal-like, the fangs, the snarling, the claws, I think there is a description of one of the scenes in which Jonathan Archer and, well, the four enemies, Dracula's enemies, are trying to defeat him, and he just escapes by jumping, and the word is like a tiger. Sorry, it's a panther, like a panther. These physical, if you see of somebody in a fit of narcissistic rage, you will see somebody who becomes suddenly like an animal. Again, showing the teeth, using the nails as claws. So it's a really literal transformation into the fighting mode of an animal. So it is quite astonishing how the descriptions of victims of narcissistic abuse are very similar to Stoker's description of Dracula in one of those feats of aggressiveness and violence.
Thank you very much. Now we have time for one more question.
Thank you for such a thought-provoking. I think I'll be fine with all this.
We need it for the recording.
Really?
Yeah. It's all right.
Is it perfect?
No?
Well, thank you for your thought-provoking talk. And I was wondering, how would you classify the Twilight vampires according to your psychiatric classification of vampires?
I think are escaping this particular definition. Yes, vampires. They're definitely mutants. And I think they are more paragons of the shiny virtue of orthodox and fundamentalist Mormon faith, and the virginity and the fact that you need to be set apart if you belong to a certain fundamentalist Christian religion, rather than this type of cultural discourse here. So I wouldn't really think of them in these terms at all. Yeah.
Kind of paradoxical evolution of the literary.
It is. I have to say I've not really read the whole saga, just a little bit here and there, and I've not watched all of the films, so I don't really know exactly how it ends and where it's all going, because I don't consider them to be part of this tradition. They are branching off at such a speed, and the direction is so completely different that I cannot really see how I could make it work if I were to describe them in these terms. I can't really say that I can.
We have the time for one more short question.
Okay, if there are no further questions in the audience, just well, I don't know if this is going to be a short question. The question is short, but the answer may be long. I'm not sure. Of course, you're familiar with Nina Auerbach's theories. Nina Auerbach and her theories concerning vampires. And she once famously stated that our vampires ourselves, claiming that vampires were emblematic of the latest stage in human civilization. Here you have outlined psychological disorder as the main sort of feature of vampirism, but don't you think it can be extended, like Nina Auerbach does, to the malignancy of society at large?
Oh, absolutely. That's why I was also using Satan as another face, another facet of the vampire myth. So everything that we know about evil, and evil has been represented in so many different ways throughout history in each and every culture. I think it is amazing how accurate. I don't know. Probably a Chinese. I'm just going to say a medieval Chinese version of a demonic force is probably comes quite close to a nowadays scientific definition of evil. And of course, that's what I was trying to point at. We do have like an individual level of psychopathy and sociopathy, but then we have also cultural and social level of it, which is what Sam Vaknin is pointing at, and it's being discussed. It's not something new, I have to say. But now we have scientific evidence that we are becoming increasingly narcissistic and malignant as a society, that we actually are sustaining and tolerating a higher number of psychopathic individuals, not just among us, but in really high positions of power. And it is just not sustainable in the long term. And also the way culture is being, through social media, the way it's being reshaped, and the speed at which things are moving, society as a whole seems to be extremely preoccupied with fantasies of grandiosity, of extreme self-worship, and in the end there is this conflict between the integral essence, if you like, of society that becomes disintegrated, and everything is what really matters is the false or external armor that shields everything and keeps everything together, keeps everything from crumbling apart. So what is worrying, I think, is that we can use the same metaphor of the vampire and the same set of scientific descriptors to describe society, Western society, and current actual nowadays society in general, I'd say.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a final round of applause for Amaya here.
Thank you.